Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the organizers and co-sponsors of tonight's program, can you hear me? Yeah. You're required to ask that. The co-sponsors and organizers of tonight's program, the Mashdot's Chair in Armenian Studies at Harvard, the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard, and the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, I want to thank you for being here. And I would like to ask our other two representatives of the co-sponsors to say a few words. I'd like to first ask Dr. David Stern to speak on behalf of the Center for Jewish Studies. Dr. Stern is the Harry Starr Professor of Classical and Modern Hebrew and Jewish Literature in the Departments of Near Eastern Languages and Literature and Comparative Literature at Harvard. Dr. Stern.
I just wanted to say, as Marc said, I'm representing the Center for Jewish Studies here at Harvard, and I just want to say that we're very proud to be able to co-sponsor this very important conference on these two unspeakable atrocities of the last century. As the opening statement in the program says, these two atrocities are often compared with a concentration on the genocidal side. And I think we think it's very important that the concentration of this conference is on actually the resistance to genocide and the commonalities and the differences between the Jewish response and the Armenian response to their respective genocidal attacks. This restores agency to the victims. So we're very proud to co-sponsor it, and I want to welcome you here. Thank you.
And Professor Russell.
Hi, welcome to the campus. About a year ago, a little over a year ago, we held a commemoration here at Harvard of the centennial of 1915. Some of you may have been there, and you'll recall that at the end, a number of people stood up with posters denouncing the Armenians, insulting, demeaning them. And as an audience and a community, we responded in a very, very Irenic, a very peaceful and very dignified manner. I was very proud of that. At the same time, I felt then, and had already discussed with NAASR, the possibility of speaking of different responses to an opponent who not only has acquiesced in the death of your ancestors, but is proud of having done so and wishes to deny it. For this reason, I proposed that we hold another conference on armed resistance to genocide. This existed far more than is generally recognized amongst the Armenian communities of historical Armenia and contiguous areas. And Armenian resistance was actually an inspiration to Jews caught up in the machinery of the monstrosity of Nazi rule. The fact that the Armenians were an inspiration is not generally recognized, and in some cases, I believe, has been deliberately silenced. We intend this evening to break that silence. Thank you.
We have a full program tonight. We will shortly be hearing from the first two of our four outstanding speakers, Eric Bogosian and Dr. Debórah Dwork. We will then have a short intermission in the foyer, during which there will be coffee and refreshments available, followed by the second pair of speakers, Dr. Dikran Kaligian and Dr. James Russell. All Q&A will be done at the end of the program. I would like to add a few words to what Professor Russell just said about why this subject. As he noted, the impetus for this program came from Professor Russell, and we were indeed discussing various plans for 2015 and beyond. And he mentioned that these were all good ideas and important subjects, as I recall, but what really interests me, he said, is the idea of resistance to genocide. It's time to do something about that, and he was absolutely right. Stepan Kaligian of the NAASR board, who's out here somewhere, also at once embraced the idea and has also been involved very much in the planning of tonight's event. So then the question is, why in the large literature on the Armenian genocide and Holocaust does armed resistance not loom larger? Though I think it's safe to say that it occupies a larger place in Holocaust scholarship than in that on the Armenian genocide. Is it because the resistance was, when viewed in absolute terms, unsuccessful? That is, the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust proceeded regardless of the acts of resistance? Is it a sense of shame over the inadequacy of the resistance? Or is it because of an idea, misguided but understandable, that Armenians and Jews need endlessly to prove and reprove their victimhood in the face of unrelenting anti-Semitism and genocide denial? Certainly in the Armenian case, I think very strongly that denial has skewed the way the entire topic is approached. Even as the genocide was being carried out, the Ottoman government was issuing publications to prove that whatever was happening to the Armenians, which of course the same government denied was happening, was a result of the Armenians' collective disloyalty and rebellion. The same approach is taken by genocide deniers today, who argue, in the words of one, that, quote, while the Armenians were victims, not all of them were innocent victims, and the disaster that overtook them, therefore, was not entirely unprovoked. The only truly adequate proof of genocide, it seems, is for each and every victim to have gone, as the saying goes, like sheep to the slaughter. But this is perverse. Armenians fought in large communities such as Van and Mush, in Zeytun, Shabinkari-Hisar, and at Musa Dagh, in small communities like Khoruchur. Jews fought back in Warsaw and Vilna, in Mir, in the extermination camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. Later, Armenians and Jews tracked down Nazis and Young Turk leaders who had planned and carried out the genocides but had escaped justice. They and their actions need to be better understood and remembered. This indeed is why we're here tonight. I would like now to introduce our first two speakers. Eric Bogosian is an acclaimed actor, playwright, and novelist. He was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his play Talk Radio and is the recipient of the Berlin International Film Festival's Silver Bear Award, 3 Obie Awards for his 6 solo performances off-Broadway, and the Drama Desk Award. His most recent book, and indeed the reason why he's here, is Operation Nemesis, the assassination plot that avenged the Armenian genocide. Dr. Debórah Dwork is Rose Professor of Holocaust History and founding director of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. One of the first historians to record Holocaust survivors' oral testimonies and use their narratives as a scholarly source, Dr. Dwork explores the social and cultural history of the Holocaust in her work. Among her award-winning books are Flight from the Reich, Jewish Refugees, 1933 to 1946, and Children with a Star, Jewish Youth in Nazi Europe. Eric Bogosian.
Thank you, Marc. Before I even begin, I just want to say that what I'm going to be talking about is rife with detail, which I just can't possibly cover all of it today. And sometimes I'm going to have to generalize, and for those of you who are historians here or know the really specific things about what I'm going to talk about, like the people to my left and right, don't punish me after I sort of generalize. I'll refer you to my book, Operation Nemesis, and I'm going to mention another book as we go along here because it's too essential to not name what we're talking. At any rate, the name of tonight's group meeting is From Musa Dagh to the Warsaw Ghetto, Armenian and Jewish Armed Resistance to Genocide. And I think the first thing that comes to mind when you hear armed resistance to genocide is, of course, the very things that Marc was just mentioning, partisan groups hiding in the Polish forests, or Armenians on top of Musa Dagh with their rifles and holding their own against this overwhelming force that's trying to grab them and exterminate them. The story I'm going to tell you about is quite different, but it is a form of armed resistance to genocide, but in a completely different fashion. This is the story of Operation Nemesis. And, but I'm going to give you some background to it first, and for those of you who've heard me talk about Operation Nemesis before, I'm going to look at it from a different angle tonight. First of all, let's start at the Ottoman Special Military Tribunals, which were held between 1919 and 1922. There were 60 cases that the Ottomans prosecuted against their own leaders, who had been leaders during World War I. And this is, by the way, this is the book you should know, Judgment at Istanbul by Vahak and Dadrian and Taner Akçam. And this is a really important book as far as Armenian genocide studies go. Not only does it cover these trials in which what happened is proven beyond a doubt, but the whole dynamics of how the genocide rolled out is all explained in this book. It's a terrific book. So these military tribunals went on, and during this period, these tribunals were pretty much a result of a promise that the British had made early on in World War I, when they first started hearing about atrocities against the Christians, particularly the Armenians, in the Ottoman Empire. In May 1915, the British made a statement on the part of their allies that when this war comes to an end, there will be war crimes trials. And for the first time, the term crimes against humanity was used historically. And so when the war came to an end and there was armistice and Britain, France, and their allies occupied Constantinople, they began arresting members of the political party that had been in power, the CUP, the Ittihad, which was the party of Talat and his ilk. And they started arresting all these people, and they tried to start getting trials going. The Turks objected to foreign powers trying their people, and so instead there were these Ottoman military tribunals. And like I said, there were 60 cases brought before these courts. And these tribunals were quite thorough, and the proofs were very, very clear about the crimes that had been committed. Now for a long time, the documentation of these trials had sort of disappeared. We believe that they're in archives in maybe Ankara, but eventually they were pieced back together again, and that's the book that I told you about. The result of these trials were a number of people were convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. And in fact, a number of players from this period were hanged at this time. But the key people weren't around. They had already left Constantinople November 1st, 1918, just before the British and the French and others had entered Constantinople, entered Turkey. Talat Pasha, Jamal Pasha, Enver Pasha, who are the men we think of as the triumvirate who ran the country, and as well as Dr. Shakir, Dr. Nazem, and other of their cohorts, had escaped via a German ship and went to Odessa, across the Black Sea, and then eventually ended up all over Europe, first in Berlin and then in other places. So that's something to just keep in mind, that these men had left, and they were the men who had been running everything. And particularly Talat Pasha, Dr. Shakir, and Dr. Nazem were specifically the architects and the men who had been running the Armenian genocide, which was a huge enterprise and required a lot of focus on the part of these leaders. Why were these men who ended up in hiding not only in Berlin, but in Rome, and also in Tbilisi and Moscow, why were these countries letting them into their countries? Why were they giving them safe haven? The reason was that Turkey was a big prize, and this is something that in all the years, at least, I mean, I look around here, everybody here is pretty much around my age or middle-aged. When we were growing up, when they talked about World War I, all you ever heard about was trench warfare, Germany versus France. That was World War I. Somehow, the Middle East didn't get talked about all that much. Lawrence of Arabia had something to do with World War I, maybe. Nobody really had a clear idea. But the truth of the matter is that the real prize at the end of World War I was the remains of the Ottoman Empire. And all the players knew that when the war came to an end, they were going to divvy up this prize. The most valuable part of the prize was what we call today Iraq. It was called Mesopotamia at the time. It was full of oil. And if you, it was known to have enormous oil resources in it. There were probably other enormous oil resources all over the Middle East. And if you ever hear from anybody that, if you hear it said that people didn't really know the value of oil or oil reserves during World War I, that's just not true. At the beginning of the war, already, certainly Winston Churchill, as Lord of the Admiralty, knew that that oil was going to be necessary to conduct war in the modern era, and especially for battleships. In the course of the war, it became more and more clear that airplanes, you can't run an airplane on coal. You have to have oil. You have to have petroleum, refined petroleum. And so they knew that there was this prize, Mesopotamia. And the reason I mention this is that these various players, Italy, France, Great Britain, and Russia, and the United States, were all sort of sneaking around behind each other's backs, trying to make different deals with the Turks. Okay, the former leaders were all out of the empire. They had escaped. There were remnants of the CUP in Constantinople, and there was a sort of a puppet sultan in place. But there was also an insurrection that had been started by Mustafa Kemal in the east, and that was the guy that everybody was laying their bets on. However that all ended up, that was probably going to be the person that people were going to have to deal with. Certainly the Russians saw him as a potential valuable ally, and by this point the Russians are Bolsheviks, and so they're supplying funds to him. The Italians are ready to sell arms to these guys. The Germans, they don't want to lose track of the people who were their allies in the first place, and the French would be making deals with the British about the oil lands. That's why we have Syria today, and what we call the modern Middle East today is the result of the deals between the British and the French. Again, I'm really generalizing very fast here, but the thing is, you just have to have an image of these people in these various cities. And what they're doing is, they're getting ready to come back. They're getting ready to return to Constantinople, not necessarily Constantinople, maybe Ankara, which will become the new capital of the new Republic of Turkey eventually. But that's where they're planning to end up. As it turns out, all the leaders, except for Mustafa Kemal, will be dead by 1926. And a number of these key people, Talat, Jamal, Said Halim Pasha, who was the former Grand Vizier, and Dr. Shakir will be assassinated by Operation Nemesis. And let me just back up a second here and just talk about the Armenian Genocide, because it's important to have some sense of what we're talking about when we talk about that. The Turks had this crazy idea, the Young Turks. I'm going to use the word Young Turks in place of CUP or Ittihad. It's not exact, but we just have to do for tonight. Not every Young Turk was in the Central Committee of the CUP. It's complicated, but we call them Young Turks right now. The Young Turks had a theory and an idea that they were going to Turkify, and weirdly this is continuing on to this day, nauseating fashion, but that they were going to Turkify the Ottoman Empire, certainly the homeland, the Vatan. They were going to get in there and they would get rid of all the Christians. And they could do this during World War I because under the fog of war, people didn't really know what was going on in this land. And so they began this process of getting rid of the Armenians. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is simply that the Armenians had great wealth and they could take it from them, and they did. First by appropriating things because it was wartime, and then later just stealing the property that belonged to people they had murdered. They didn't just take property, they took businesses, They took children, they took everything from the Armenians and also the Greeks and the Nestorians. And again, when I say Armenians, you just have to, in your mind, be thinking that I'm also mentioning, I'm talking about Greek Christians, Pontic Greeks, and Nestorians as well. So this is the plan. The plan is to exterminate, get rid of, remove these people who are a problem. And it's done in 3 stages. First of all, make sure there are no young men around in this, during this period. We're going to get rid of all the young Armenian men. Now up till 1908, until the revolution, Christians then weren't really in the army. They couldn't be drafted. They paid a tax, and they were exempted from the army. But after 1908, they entered the army. In fact, there were many Armenians who were officers in the Ottoman Empire, something that also gets denied constantly by modern-day Turkey. But there were Armenians served important purposes. I know one guy whose grandfather was a armaments technician, and he kept the Krupp artillery in good repair in Gallipoli, and he was decorated by Mustafa Kemal for his work. So this was an Armenian guy who did this. Eventually he ran away knowing that he would be sent off to be killed as well. But what happened was, so Armenians get drafted, Armenians are drafted, the war begins, and then Armenian men in the army are disarmed soon after that, and they instead are put into what we call labor battalions. They are unarmed men who are basically slaves and do things like build roads and break rocks. And they're used as slaves until they die, or they can be culled. Just groups of men, when they're done doing what they need to do with them, taken off to some remote valley and killed. The key thing here is that young men are subject to the draft, and they either have to run away or they get drafted, and this is a story that continues throughout the war. But it gets rid of all young men. Basically, young men are on the run, they're gone. The next step is to arrest and eventually kill all community leaders. This can be political leaders, this can be people who are actually politically active, or it can be somebody who's as unlikely a leader as Komidas, the composer, who was arrested on April 24th, 1915 in Constantinople, along with hundreds of other men. But basically anybody who's a community leader, pharmacists, doctors, lawyers, priests, all these people are arrested and they are removed. People don't know where they're going. Sometimes they had a sense of what was happening, but in many cases communities didn't know where these men went. They were arrested, they were taken away, and they were killed. So now you don't have anybody leading the community, and all that's left are the women, the children, and the elderly, and the deportations begin. And the correct term is relocations, because they were not deported out of the country. They were sent through the desert to either northern Syria, or in the case of Trebizond, actually taken out in boats and drowned in the Black Sea. But these long marches, these deportations, were so harsh that vast numbers of people died while they were on them. Very few survived. If they did survive, they made it as far as the concentration camps in Syria. Deir Zor, which you hear in the news all the time today, it was the biggest, I think, of the concentration camps. And then even there, people died of typhus, of cholera, and even there, people were culled and sent into the desert and killed. So enormous numbers of people killed. Genocide.